Dobrego ranku, Sim. Good morning, everyone. It is our great pleasure to be able to welcome you on today's event, which is a next step in our joint endeavor, trying is part of the repurposed activities together with the business, but also this time joined by colleagues from the labor inspection, from the State Labor Service, joining us to identify ways and means to address the risks in relation to forced labor and trafficking in human beings in connection to the situation of the war in Ukraine and the displacement and the vulnerabilities related to this. I want to say that from the beginning of the conflict, we have early on addressed entry points together with the State Labor Service colleagues that have joined us today. And also, as we went on, the business community led by the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine have took the lead really in developing the guiding principles and then taking on with the campaign with Ukraine without forced labor. Today's is a working day when we will brainstorm together, and I think it will be absolutely necessary that you are active, that you're participating, because in fact, what we are put a quite ambitious task for today, maybe not yet to determine, but certainly to explore and find the modalities that will be the Ukrainian model, how to do this. What can be done by the businesses and the labor inspection to have reduced risks when it comes to this phenomenon, such as trafficking in human beings and forced labor. And I think what we will try to do, of course, today, and there are certain nuances here. We will try to go through them and try to present you the various options. And I want to make it clear from the beginning that none of these models are applicable 100%. Not all these models are being mean as a suggestion, not at all. They will all serve the purpose of setting the scene, of trying to provide munition, food for thought for the discussion, to make sure that we start the process, at least today, whereby we could arrive to a solution that would work. Without further ado, I want to say on behalf of our project and colleagues from the ILO, our sincere appreciation for the collaboration we have had the privilege to enjoy with the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine in this field as well. And without taking more of your time in the opening remarks, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Alexei Mirosnichenko, the President of the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine, for his opening remarks. Mr. Mirosnichenko, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, Jolt. I'm indeed very happy to welcome you all, and I'd like to say that I appreciate the ILO and the team, Jolt, Sophia. There has been a lot of active work that we have done while drafting the guidelines. I checked with my friends about half a year ago, trying to see how they perceive forced labor. What is forced labor to them? And what they told me suggests that, forced labor is a case where somebody takes your papers, your documents, and you make people work on certain premises. They typically work for food. So that's typically the idea that I can hear about that. But while working with the ILO team, we have seen a different way of looking at forced labor. So our guidelines address forced labor relationships, trafficking in people, forced labor, eradicating the worst forms of child labor. So all of that allowed us to take a totally different look at things. So what I heard from people is not in line with the way the ILO sees it. The world sees this problem of forced labor. I'm not going to go through all of these guidelines because later on, Elena Stepanenko will give us all of the detail on that. She will go through them piecemeal. So while drafting the guidelines, we have been able to dovetail the international practices and the way we perceive it. So there is still a lot of work yet to be done to keep addressing forced labor in this country. I also would like to say that I appreciate the Business Association. They have contributed to the guidelines since December. When we did the official presentation, we have received a lot of proposed improvements, additional points, and we appreciate all of that. Also, kudos to the SLS, in particular, Mr. Dignera. We have been able to work constructively with the SLS, trying to see what the government could do. What are the capacities of the government to get the businesses to follow these principles? And basically, it should be like a carrot and stick approach. So there should be incentives apart from penalties or punishments. So Igor will tell us more about this later, and there will be more colleagues addressing the point. So we're looking for these mechanisms. We checked with the Ministry of Economy about that, again, trying to see how can the government motivate the businesses to follow this pathway. So I guess one of the outcomes today could be some of these principles. We need to tentatively find them. The Confederation will keep moving on, so guidelines are not the end of the story. In our website, you will see what projects we do, and this one is one of the most important projects. So we're going to keep improving the guidelines, and hopefully ILO will be by our side. So we're going to have a lot of work yet to be done. Today's event happens just before the OSH Day. I think it is symbolic in a way. So once again, I'd like to say a big thanks to the ILO team, Zsolt and Sofia. You are classy partners. I enjoyed working with you, and hopefully there's going to be a way to do this in future. Thank you all again. Best of luck to you all, guys.
Dużo dziękuję. Thank you very much, Mr. Miroshnichenko. And really, I would like to return the straight away saying it has been a pleasure working with you and your team in this field. And thank you very much for your strong support, having identified this area as an important one for business, where we certainly at your disposal in these endeavors. Let's hope indeed, guided by the wealth of knowledge that we have in the room from the business, and also colleagues from the State Labor Service and others have joined us, that we'll be able to find good approaches indeed. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Igor Dignera, who is the head of State Labor Service of Ukraine. And also want to say that from the very beginning of the war in Ukraine, we have had brainstormings discussing ways and means how the State Labor Service can and did, in fact, support the whole endeavor of reducing risks and leading a public awareness campaign early on that have reached now a significant number of people, and also the activities. But no doubt, Mr. Dignera will be able to tell us better himself. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Igor Dignera. Mr. Dignera, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Zsolt. And I'm happy to see such a good turnout. Lots of people from territorial units of the SLS. So combating forced labor and trafficking in humans has always been on the agenda. The country is experiencing war, and it's been a kind of an impetus to all social dialogue parties to take a long, hard look at that. The SLS, aka Labor Inspectorate, also thinks about forced labor and trafficking, and to us is quite a priority. The Inspectorate is a part of the system that is supposed to address forced labor and trafficking in humans. And this is quite an important part of that system, because we work on the ground and we can see where it's at with the workers here and there. So we can identify the risks, we can see the problem areas, and we can report it up the chain so that other institutions could do something to stop forced labor from happening. Businesses themselves are also mindful of that, and we can see a change in approaches and visions. So we all are now having a common goal, and the goal is to have safe and decent work in this country for all people that are employed. Alexei has rightly underlined the constructive collaboration that's been going on. We have had quite a number of discussions over how to stimulate the employers. We as the SLS are ready to contribute to this cause. We're going to try and make sure that employers could understand the need to do it, and that would find an incentive for themselves to take care of labor rights of workers, hired workers. So we fully support this cause and we're ready to work with them along these lines. We can review the risk assessment criteria. We can do a lot more than that. This will be a continued effort, and we will need to find the right methodology and discuss a lot of things. But certain steps, initial steps have been made, and we both are on the same page. So I guess over time, we will be able to deliver and we will come up with a product which will be a good incentive for employers, which will take care of hired workers. As Jolt earlier suggested, well, indeed, as the war began, our inspectors have done quite a lot of work to raise public awareness of the risks that can be out there for the people. Last spring, I remember the long lines of people trying to leave the country, and at that point, they were not thinking about forced labor and trafficking, but we as professionals have been able to understand that that thing is there, and some people may be exposed to that, and there are many crooks and fraudsters that could capitalize on the problems these people have experienced at that moment. Right now, you get more than 4 million of people from this country that have been covered with the awareness-raising campaigns this way or another, and it's been quite a lot of it's quite a complicated and niggling work that should be done in order to let the people get the point and receive this information. So I appreciate each inspector who has been able to do something to make it possible. So last year we have gone through a lot. There were power outages, security issues, all of that. But the inspectors would keep on doing their thing no matter what, contributing to this cause. So in this regard, I'd like to say that I do appreciate the work that has been done. If one life has been saved as a result of that, then it was not a waste of time. That's how I see it. Thank you, Joel. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you very much, Mr. Degnera. I think what you just said, it really resonates with me. If we manage to save at least one life, that means that our effort was not wasted. I think this should be the motto also for our meeting today when we are exploring new ways and means how we can reduce these risks any further. I also wanted to let you know that the ILO at various levels is taking on this this endeavor as well. And of course, it was mentioned earlier, and we have the unique opportunity today to have the business community, but also the state labor service, the labor inspection with us, which covering a very important part of what can be done to reduce the risks. But also the ILO participates in the regional anti-trafficking task force with all the other UN agencies, and also at the Geneva level in ICAT and various UN and non-UN fora, where we are raising issues, where we are advocating, where we are certainly trying to contribute to this discussion, as forced labor is one of the core labor standards, and it's one of the key areas of ILO's work in terms of bringing it into compliance. I'm also very happy to have my colleague Laura Green with us from the Global Business Network on forced labor. She will have a presentation later on, and we have been working also very closely with the ACTEMP and the employer specialists in the office in Budapest from the ILO, with Julia Drumea, the senior employer specialist, and also colleagues from ACTEMP in Geneva who have been working and fully in the picture when it comes to all these issues. I think also it's worthwhile to say that trafficking in human being and forced labor, apart from being a labor issue and apart from being a business issue, it's also a criminal issue. And as such, the criminals are usually 1 or 2 steps ahead. And while the figures for a number of identified victims from Ukraine and in connection to the displacement related to war remains very, very small, it is only partially to the fact that has been good campaigns and partially to the fact that has been a good, solid response by all of us. But also, we always keep on moving. We need to identify the new ways and means how this unfortunate phenomenon is developing. And I think it is quickly evolving and quickly changing, and we need to be changing with it as well. And also, this is one of the ways how today's meeting was conceived. Also, I want to raise few of these things that we have been discussing before in transiting almost from the introductory to the discussion part. Yes, indeed, the guiding principles have been developed, but as Mr. Miroshnichenko himself mentioned, this is a living document. This is something that is constantly being improved, constantly being further developed, reassessed, and worked with. And I think this is important to bear in mind. And some of the indicators we have been discussing, and indeed, this was also in the opening statement mentioned by Mr. Miroshnichenko, it is, despite what you think, it is often not people in chains who are starving, who are in so difficult situation, but it's much more subtle, much more indirect, often things when it comes to what is forced labor and what is human trafficking. For example, on the freedom of movement, you do have, as a strong indicator, you have occasionally places where it's not possible to leave one's premises, especially when it is, but also it is the indirect ones, such as your digital freedom, the way how you used to get information, and limiting that digital freedom by not being able to access sources of information that you've been doing. That is really also. So many of these indicators, it was also mentioned by Mr. Degnera, needs to be looked in a wider, in a more contemporary, in an evolving way. And these indicators are changing. And I think it's good both for the business colleagues representing the employer side, but also from the State Labor Service to be aware of those, because it is an ongoing debate. Having said that, I would, and thank you very much for Sophia in the chat, posting the guiding principles on the employers that we have been very closely being involved in since last summer, where we started these consultations and works. So these guidance are there available in the chat. I would like to move on, if you agree with me, to the next part of our event, which is about setting the scene and looking into the examples and modalities of employers' compliance with guidance on forced labor and trafficking, because I think it is worth to know and examine some of the different approaches that exist and look into our knowledge today. And based on this, we can have perhaps an interesting discussion. I would kindly ask the technical colleagues to put on the presentation if it's possible. And in the meantime, thank you very much, Sophia, for more materials that were posted there. So if we can go to the presentation and to start the discussion, that would be appreciated. So if we can go to the first slide. Indeed, today what we will try to do together with you is to look into the compliance models that are ranging from the positive to the negative, the ones that are going on a more encouragement, that are entirely voluntary, the ones that are soft, the ones that are harder, and look based on this, we'll find the ways. Of course, the codes of conduct or the guiding principles that have been developed in many countries, and this is what we mentioned, that they are living documents. They also helping us in many ways to look into what and how to apply them, how to find ways that they are really being useful, not just another paper that we develop with great effort and enthusiasm, and then we put it on the shelf and it will gather dust, but rather to have it really as a useful document. So of course, once there is a guiding principle or a code of conduct, it's good to establish the provisions and the benchmarks, to split this into much more practical steps. What are the ones that could be done to put this in life? What needs to be done to implement? What are the steps that can be done in actually making sure that this is not just a guidance? Of course, the compliance with the code is an important one. And today's meeting is mainly focusing on this part here, the second part, about the compliance with the code. In the world, you have audits, you have social audits, you have these both external and of course internal ones that companies or sectors or businesses themselves would like to do. I think in the previous meetings we have talked about examples of these social audits that been done even in huge companies that are involved with everyday aspects of our lives, whether we're talking about the iPhones or the clothes we wear that mostly being produced in other parts of the world, and the different industries that are part of our daily life. The important part here is to try to identify the risks and the identification of non-compliance in case when it comes to these issues. So where are these risks? Where are the issues that are important to look in? And this is also the part where there is a joint interest, both for the labor inspectorates, but also for the businesses. Where are these risks? Where are the points that you're looking into it? It's almost like an entry point to all of this. Of course, once some of these issues are being identified, the best solution by all means is to take corrective action to achieve compliance. I think what it is in the ILO jargon, for those when dealing with labor inspection and issues regarding the supervisory role of implementation and enforcement of labor legislation, we increasingly, rather than enforcing compliance, we're talking much more about promoting the culture of compliance. In other words, it is an absolute necessity for labor inspectorates to develop those soft skills, that it's not only enforcing the law through the means of this, but also promoting the culture, promoting the whole notion that it is uncool for businesses to be part of this. It is uncool to be associated with issues related to forced labor and trafficking, but also rather than just to warn, to write fines or to use, again, it was mentioned in the opening remarks, either the carrot or the stick, to promote the culture, to make sure that companies themselves are doing it. And I understand that there will be some presentations later on that will talk about some of that as an idea that has been floating around. The next one, of course, establishing a grievance mechanisms. If there are some issues where there's a problem and people are bringing it up, there should be channels to actually address those before they become too big. And I think it is an interest both for the companies, the enterprises or the businesses, but also for the labor inspectorates to do. Of course, follow-up assessments. Once there is an agreement how to resolve a problem, there should be a deadline, there should be a follow-up, and there should be ways and means how these steps could be corrected. So once there is a guiding principle, once there is a code of conduct, it is also, as we do have now, developed by the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine, it is really important to raise awareness. And today, this event is taking place in the context of Ukraine without forced labor. And so this is really part of the campaign. And this campaign should be ongoing. This campaign should be almost permanent, because it will need to be with a very strong public awareness element that it can actually be sustained, especially in the longer term, to make an impact. So who are you raising awareness to? Of course, it's not only the business communities and only within the business communities, but also the workers. They need to know these things, and they need to be warned. They need to be, of course, trained and aware themselves about their rights. Many of the cases where you find Ukrainians ending up in EU countries in situation of forced labor or trafficking, there are lots of anecdotal evidence that the recruitment pattern that was there was initially, at least, being seen a good colleague or another worker, or there is being enforced by someone. And there is often a lack of knowledge or lack of rights that there's actually another method. Of course, managers and supervisors are important, the business partners, and of course, here it is already mentioned about labor inspection. These trainings about the code of conduct should bring together the employers and the business community with the labor inspector, so that they know both what what are the key provisions here, and what are the focuses, and what are the entry points. Of course, training and capacity building has been mentioned. It's important, working with the relevant stakeholders, and of course, communication and reporting on the performance. I think we all need to be better in communicating the successes that are there, the good stories, the ones when actually made a difference, and of course, we'll need to make those that are benchmarks, and it's reflected in the internal reportings on performance, both from the side of the institutions that we have the pleasure of hosting today. I want to make it a bit more concrete. I will have two examples today with you, and then my colleague Laura from the ILO headquarters in Geneva, from the global network, will have other examples. I would want to share with you two examples, and again, I want to make it clear from the start. I'm not suggesting that these models are relevant for Ukraine. This is for inspiration. This is for you to know and for you to be let's say, knowledgeable about what is out there, what are the methods that have been tried and to extent have worked. But again, the solution in Ukraine will be a Ukrainian solution, the solution that you come up with through social dialogue and the involvement of the tripartite constituents. But nonetheless, being knowledgeable does not hurt. And in this respect, in setting the scene for the discussion, I wanted to share with you these two examples. One is an example of Brazil and the National Pact for the eradication of so-called slave labor, often forced labor and trafficking, even though it could be another subject of trainings when it comes to slave labor or modern slavery, as it is often called in even international media. I don't want to go into a legal hair splitting now, but this is the title. And the other example that I will get on later is the proposed ban by the European Union of all products from the markets of the European Union that are made with forced labor. So these are the two examples that I will focus on. And I think they are really for inspiration. So if we can go to the next slide. So eradicating forced labor from the supply chains through social dialogue. And again, it is a multifaceted one. And it started off back in May 2005 in results of actually rather worrisome statistics and scenes that were actually almost like an adventure movie. And with the mobile teams established by the Brazilian labor inspectorates, there were some colleagues from labor inspectorates that paid with their lives for some of these raids and issues in the different farms. But nonetheless, this whole initiative started off. It was multifaceted with raising awareness, building capacity, making sure that there's a sustainability, but also strengthening dialogue and collaboration between the Brazilian, but also international companies there. The objective was to motivate more and more companies to become signatories or at least to support the objectives of the National Pact and its effective implementation. And again, we will share these presentations with you. You don't need to make notes. They will be there with you as we are progressing. So basically, as I mentioned, it was established in May 2005 already, and it started off as a voluntary commitment by roughly around 200 enterprises that covered approximately 20% of the GDP of Brazil. And the idea was to promote the culture of compliance among businesses and employer organizations to respect labor rights. And initially among the signatories, it included large iron and steel industry, but it is also important that some were left out: the beef, soya, and cotton production. All of them are with rather significant risk, potentially of risks for forced labor and trafficking. They did not join that one. There is a so-called dirty list. A dirty list, again, this is an example of negative, let's say, focus on the negative, naming and shaming a part of the one, which includes monitoring by the civil society. And there is a management committee that includes the social partners, but also civil society and the press with their own code of conduct that is being applied. So basically, the dirty list is a list of companies that were found not in compliance with the basic principles that relate to forced labor and trafficking. And just to let you know that, at least initially, the idea was that once you're on this so-called dirty list, which is public, you are there for at least 2 years, and there are certain benchmarks and steps that needed to be presented to get off that dirty list. Of course, the whole thing was linked not only to labor rights and not only to forced labor and trafficking indicators, but also to corporate social responsibility. This is just in the National Pact of Brazil, some of the signatories that I wanted to share with you that have been involved with this. You could see some of the big companies, Carrefour, Walmart, Shell. You have Banco Santander, Coca-Cola, you have McDonald's, Petrobras, which is also a huge Repsol, oil companies, Banco do Brasil, Texaco even, and Esso and others. So you could see that, and there it's not, there are more companies. This is just naming few that have been involved with this. Now, again, I would like to say that I think it is our understanding, talking to colleagues who have been working with this, that it has been a rather successful attempt to look into curbing the occurrence of and better identification and reducing of the risks. But also, I think it is indicative that that probably when we were going to discuss this approach, the Brazilian example and the model, I think in the context of Central Eastern Europe, the positive discrimination rather than the negative discrimination could be perhaps a better way. In other words, rather than a dirty list, to have perhaps a white list of companies that are actually complying with. So it is the positive encouragement rather than the negative one. But nonetheless, I think this is something that I leave it out for you for the discussion and for the presentations and the panel that will the segment that will deal with the starting the process, what is most appropriate for Ukraine. Because I think this is important in many ways also, especially since Ukraine has been granted candidate country status with the European Union. And so the developments within the European Union are certainly are important, not only because of the country's politically stated objective of closer integration and full membership eventually with the European Union, but also because of businesses are increasingly having a much closer cooperation with businesses and access to the market of the European Union. So I think it is quite important for you to know that, and this is something that is relatively recent, that on the 14th of September 2022, the Commission presented a proposal for a regulation to prohibit all products made using forced labor, including child labor, on the internal market of the European Union. So this effort is actually in line with the EU efforts, not just in Europe, but and not just in relation to countries that are in a candidate country status, but worldwide. It means this proposal, it covers all products made available within the EU market. So it's both for those for domestic consumption, but also for export, but also imported goods. It includes to any types, including components regardless of the sector or the industry. And the idea is that it will be actually, even though it's initiated by the Commission, it will be and welcome participants that are joining now. I see in the chat that there are more and more joining us. It is our great pleasure to have you. So the member states of the European Union will be responsible for the enforcement of the regulation provisions, which means that the national authorities, and often the case, it will be also the inspectorates, I presume, will be empowered to withdraw products made using forced labor from the EU market following an investigation. Now, when I talked about the labor inspectorates, I'm talking about issues related to undeclared work or that of forced labor, not the products itself. Customs authorities would identify and stop products made using forced labor at the borders of the EU. So this is at the moment a proposal. These are the steps within for you to know how the proposed EU ban on products made with forced labor. These are the steps that we'll have to go through. This is the process, how it is going through. Of course, it is the Commission proposal. There will be discussions in the national parliaments, and we already passed that. We have had concrete proposals from national parliaments, their opinions, draft reports, and of course, it is a process before it will be adopted. But nonetheless, I think it is interesting to note. And I think I will just, in setting the scene, would also like to share with you some of the larger picture on this, because I think it is worthwhile to see that this is not happening, this new proposal by the European Union in isolation. In fact, the proposal is very much in line with the EU's action plan on human rights. This was meant for 2020 to 2024. That includes the priority of eradication of forced labor and the implementation of international standards on responsible business conduct. This is also globally an important point for the European Commission as well on decent work worldwide. And of course, it's worthwhile to note that there are these forced labor business guidance issued by the European External Action Service that explains the practical aspects of due diligence and provides an overview of EU and international instruments regarding responsible business conduct that are relevant also for forced labor. I think it's also important to see and show the interaction here that often when we also discuss issues related to occupational safety and health or ILO conventions and then EU standards, we see that there is almost a thing that is not exactly being seen as same part of the same pot, but indeed it is. Because on the international level, the Commission's proposal is very much linked and being inspired with the guiding principles of the ILO Convention, which are also part of so-called core labor standards. We're talking here about Convention 29 and that of 105, but also the recently, a few years ago, adopted protocol to the Convention and the ILO Recommendation 203. Eradication of forced labor is also part of the UN larger Sustainable Development Goals. So it was mentioned that it is linked to the respect of human rights and linked to the treaty, the very treaty of the European Union, which binds the EU's activities and the Charter of Fundamental Rights and European Convention of Human Rights, particularly Article 6, and also the prohibition of forced labor, Article 5, and the European Convention of Human Rights, also Article 4. So this is just a sort of snapshot of legal instruments that already this ties into, just to say. So it also complements the existing legislative framework, because at the moment no European Union legislation exists that would empower the member states to ban products made with forced labor. The EU, though, and I think it's important for you to know, has several pieces of legislation in place to tackle forced labor, in particularly the directives that I mentioned here on combating human trafficking, on sanctions against employers of migrants in irregular situation, but also, this is also a relatively new development from February last year. The Commission submitted a proposal for the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, which will be a really, really important one. And I think it is worthwhile to mention that when we talk about, of course, from the ILO's perspective, important, all EU members have ratified the Convention 29 about forced labor, and so did Ukraine. So let's just explain the European Parliament's view on this and the position that has been known, and so on, so on. So the European Parliament also has called for a ban on products made with forced labor. Of late, in June 22, the resolution on new trade instrument to ban products made by forced labor, and called for cooperation with partners supporting ending forced labor globally and banning goods. And of course, earlier on in March 2021, a resolution regarding sustainable and responsible corporate behavior, the European Parliament called for a ban on importing products related to severe human rights violations, such as forced or child labor. Again, this is also two of the core ILO labor standards and issues of priority, but also the European Parliament stressed the objective of combating practices that must be included in all free trade agreements that the European Union concludes with countries around the world. So basically, just to get further familiar with this proposal as of late. So the member states would be required to appoint one or more competent authorities responsible for the tasks. This would be, this is as it's stipulated in Article 12. The authorities would be asked to follow a risk-based approach, which is important. So it's not just a dogmatic mechanical application of issues, but a risk-based approach. This would be Article 4. Which means that they should focus on the efforts on products, companies, and places where the risk of forced labor are the most prevalent and where the impact is likely to be the largest. So the emphasis will thus likely to be on businesses at the early stages of the value chain, importers, manufacturers, producers, or products suppliers. So the authorities would be asked to start investigations on products for which there are well-founded suspicion that they have been made using forced labor. This is the envisaged Article 5. Should they find evidence for these suspicions, they would, the decision in order to withdraw of the products already placed on the market, or prohibit placing these products on the market or exporting them. So these would be communicated to the company, would be obliged to dispose of the products in question. This is Article 6. So it will be also communicated, of course, and need to be communicated to the customs authorities of the given member state. And of course, it will be prohibited to the release of circulation for export of the products concerned. And this will be also made sure that it's disposed of in line with this. And also they will be obliged to inform the European Commission about this through the member states of their decision. So this is stipulated in the envisaged Article 9. Let's just take a look at what will that mean for the industry, and what would be this for implications for some of the businesses. So all businesses making products available on the EU market, as it was mentioned earlier, exporting from it would be covered by the new rules. The Commission excluded a minimum threshold for the volume or the value of products below which no investigation would be launched. It means that there is no small amount that would justify not launching an investigation for this. So while such a threshold would exempt small and medium-sized enterprises from the new measures, the Commission deems such an exemption likely to jeopardize the effectiveness of the proposal and create a legal uncertainty. So the proposal instead envisages specific measures for SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So before initiating a formal investigation, competent authorities would, for example, consider the size, resources, the economic operators' concerns, as well as the scale of the risks of forced labor. So there will be special treatment for small and medium enterprises, but they will not be let off the hook, even though there are special measures, and no one, as envisaged at the moment, will be looked into that. So all companies would receive guidelines within the EU I'm talking about, giving advice on where and how to detect forced labor in their supply chains, for instance, and SMEs would benefit from additional support tools. And of course, the companies would be required to dispose of goods in question and bear the cost of the disposal. If the company would not follow the decision of the member state under the proposed regulation, there would be penalties under national law as it stands at the moment. So basically, if you look, the two proposals that I have been trying to describe to you, they're looking into the prohibitive examples, or in certain extent combining the prohibitive with the encouragement of the trainings and additional guidelines and issues. And I also wanted to say that Business Europe have made their comments for this new plan known. They will also have some concerns expressed by the business, and this is still very much in progress. And I think it will be very interesting to follow this discussion, and important for businesses also in Ukraine to see what will be the final version of this and the outcome, because certainly there are issues there. For example, Business Europe have raised the issue, how will this link to due diligence already guidelines in practice, and making sure that there are no overlaps or creating additional administrative costs for businesses within the European Union, and how will that play out? And also the specifics, what kind of support will be available for small and medium enterprises that are there. So basically, these were two examples that I wanted to share with you to help in the deliberations today. What I would suggest is that we will go now to my colleague Laura for her presentation, and perhaps leave some space at the end for discussions. And we can go to the last one, the last slide, because there was in Ukrainian saying "Дуже дякую за увагу." And then, unless there are very urgent questions now, I would perhaps suggest to go to the presentation by Laura about other approaches, and then we'll take the questions to both presentations. Would that be acceptable to you? I see no objection here, so perhaps that is acceptable to you. So I would like to then, sliding back to my role as a facilitator, would like to hand over and ask Mrs. Laura Green, who's a technical officer from the Global Business Network on Forced Labor, hosted by the ILO headquarters in Geneva. Laura, thank you very much for being with us, not for the first time, for your continued support and enriching and guiding our discussions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for having me back again. It's nice to be able to continue the discussions and to see how everything's evolving, and really congratulations on the guidelines that have been developed. I thought today, just as a complement to Zsolt's presentation, and please forgive me, I don't have a PowerPoint ready for you. I will keep this quite informal, but I'm very happy to share links or any other documentation with you afterwards, if need be. I'm going to share a few examples of promoting the culture of compliance, as Zsolt has so eloquently put it, and with some of the examples from the Global Business Network. Some of these will come from members themselves, but also others are just these that we come across in our work on at a global level, and that perhaps may act as inspiration to you as you move forward. So firstly, just very briefly, the Global Business Network on Forced Labour, it was established in June of 2018, and it's a place where companies, but also where business associations come together to exchange. And I think as part of this idea of promoting compliance or a culture of compliance, it's really important to, alongside the initiatives, to be able to foster dialogue in a place where companies can exchange, support peer learning, and really look at how do they overcome the challenges related to forced labour, because it's not always easy. And I think that the network has created the safe space for that. It was something that was asked of us after the Protocol to Convention 29 was adopted, to allow businesses to come together to discuss what is it that they need from governments, what is it that they should be doing themselves, and how do they use the ongoing work of the ILO to be able to build on that and for us to work together. So there are a few examples that I'll share from employer organizations, but also from industry associations, and then looking more towards what the network itself has also been doing. I firstly wanted to focus on some of those related to recruitment, but then also looking at awards and other approaches, and how these are taken forward. I think in terms of just as a general approach from employer organizations, we largely see a lot of focus on providing advice, on raising awareness. And then some others have taken this further, being able to, for example, have a focal point on forced labour, who then can disseminate advice and information, and also looking to organize workshops, etc., and really engaging with their members on this topic. So there are a variety of ways of which we've seen this occurring. Very specifically on recruitment, I want to give you an example primarily from Vietnam, where we've seen that associations, so recruitment associations, in this case in Vietnam, the Vietnamese Association for Manpower, they have adopted codes of conduct. So this then applies to the industry and to their members of their association. And they've also then subsequently developed monitoring tools to complement this code of conduct. And I think that this was an important step. It's been a voluntary initiative on the part of the private recruitment agencies. It's been supported by ILO and later also IOM, the International Organization for Migration. And it's been an opportunity for them to actively engage their membership on this topic. The Code of Conduct specifically looks at preventing forced labour and human trafficking, and also just in general promoting fair recruitment. It was a long time coming. It was a fairly long process of first just developing the Code of Conduct, and then subsequently the monitoring instruments. But what it's done over time is really allowed this association, the Manpower Association, to engage with their membership specifically on this code of conduct. So each year there's a process of evaluation that takes place, and what I think is quite nice about this approach is that it results in a rating for each organization. So it's not necessarily about publishing what they did wrong or what they did badly, but rather coming up for an overall rating for the particular recruitment agency at the end. So this then culminates in an award ceremony where the certificates with the various ratings, it's a rating of 1 out of 5, is then presented to the recruitment agency. So it's a way of framing this in a positive sense of tracking progress towards the full achievement of the code of conduct. It's also led to the industry within Vietnam being more widely respected. I think many people actually use this, looking for the Vietnamese Association for the ranking for the list of agencies, because they have taken proactive steps towards upholding their code of conduct. And I think given the involvement of the ILO and the IOM and the support that's been provided, particularly in terms of strengthening the monitoring tools of this code of conduct, it's also helped them to further gain traction. So I know that this is something very specific to a recruitment industry, but it's an idea as to how a specific industry has come together to support, particularly on the topic of forced labor and fair recruitment. We have seen other examples of this. Something very similar has been done in Cambodia, again, starting with a code of conduct and transferring this into monitoring. However, I think the case of Vietnam is a bit more well developed in terms of the monitoring and the awarding of the rankings at the end of the day. Another example that I wanted to give you that is perhaps just complementary to this, it's not necessarily driven by employers, but it's the Migrant Recruitment Advisor. The ILO has been working on this for quite some time, supporting the International Trade Union Confederation, and they have been working on a platform which they've called TripAdvisor for recruitment agencies. And so this is an example of something coming from the other end, where basically migrant workers are encouraged to enter information into this platform and to provide a ranking and a rating for various recruitment agencies. And I think that the private sector, at least the employers that we work with, have been using this to then look for the good actors, for good recruitment agencies that are able to work with workers in a fair manner and to provide job matching services, etc., and recruitment services. So that's also something that's been well received from the other end, if you will. But again, an ability to frame this in a positive light and to provide rankings in that way. So that's an example of how an industry has taken a code of conduct and then subsequently turned this into an opportunity to monitor and also to recognize the actors within their associations for the good practices that they've taken. More broadly than that, I think there are a couple of things. There's certain benchmarking instruments that have been used more increasingly in recent years. We see awards that are being done, and then sort of proactive opportunities, for example, through documenting case studies, etc. So I'll take you through a couple of examples of this. So firstly, related to benchmarking, I think the most common one that we know at this point in time is Know the Chain. There are also others such as corporate human rights benchmarking. These are done by independent bodies, and they produce them for specific sectors generally, particularly in the case of Know the Chain. They have one on telecommunications, for example. They have one on electronics, on garments, and these are published periodically, and it's an opportunity for companies to, against the criteria which are determined by this body, Know the Chain, for them to be ranked and rated. I know that this can obviously be quite challenging for some companies. It's not necessarily that all of them like being engaged in this process, and often it's been done on, for example, public information, and there's not necessarily enough available. So there are certain challenges related to benchmarking to begin with. However, I think Know the Chain, for example, is becoming more and more sophisticated in recent years. There's also been a lot more opportunity for engagement by the company. So for them to provide input into the systems and to respond to the rankings. And I think that as much as perhaps this has not necessarily been welcomed by companies in the beginning, that has begun to change over time. I also think that this is something that was perhaps imposed on industry from an external actor rather than being driven by industry itself. So in terms of shaping this or changing this approach, having something that's really driven more internally can help ultimately to, for example, as you have the guidelines that have been developed, but subsequently also how do we then benchmark or track progress. One thing that I'm seeing increasingly among companies is looking for benchmarking around key performance indicators, but by industry associations themselves. This is still very much in its infancy, so I won't mention the name of the association, but we are beginning to work with them to look at how they will shape these indicators or measurement tools, reporting tools for their association, and for them to be able to take ownership of that and to begin to work on or internalize the key performance indicators. So that's in terms of benchmarking what currently exists. As I think the key ones to look at there, if you're interested in more information, is Know the Chain, but also similarly corporate human rights benchmark. In terms of awards, I'll first give you some examples of perhaps more broadly under the umbrella of corporate social responsibility, and then also an example from the network itself that we ran a little while ago. So firstly, I think generally the awards that we've seen in the past, they've been focused on, which is perhaps a slightly outdated term these days, the corporate social responsibility. More and more of these, they encompass social and environmental aspects. However, I think more recently we've seen some of these focusing specifically on the social aspect. I think in general, particularly in terms of environmental and social governance, we've seen a lot more around environmental aspects, and perhaps there are lessons to be learned from that as you go forward, to take inspiration from how it's been applied in the environmental context and to what could then be done in the social context. But in order to be able to really highlight the social, or the S and the ESG, as many people are saying, that this is something that's been underlooked at, it hasn't had enough attention. And so there've been a few things more globally that are being done. For example, the Thomson Reuters Foundation Stop Slavery Award. This has been running since 2015, but it's just continued to grow and been expanded in 2019. To include different categories. It now, for example, includes also journalism, etc., whereas before it was primarily focused on looking at actions of companies. And I think today this award, what it's done is obviously it gives companies something positive to be speaking about. It's an opportunity to showcase action, and it's run by an independent body, which allows for credibility and investigation. So I mean, that's something more global and very specific on slavery. They look at modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor. There are others, such as the Global Good Awards, and these really look more broadly at social aspects. We've seen one recently launched by the US Department of Labor, actually, that's focused specifically on the elimination of child labor. And that was launched only very recently. So we'll be interested to see how that evolves also over time. There are some that are run nationally by governments, but also by chambers of commerce that take this on. Again, generally these fall under more broad categories, looking generally at social responsibility. And one example there is India, that runs an annual award for socially responsible companies. Within the ILO Global Business Network on Forced Labour, we also were looking at this challenge of, well, how do we recognize the positive contributions of companies, in particular the small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, as we know, usually these are all negative headlines that come into the newspaper, but there's very little that's being done to positively recognize the actions of companies. And so in an effort to be able to, one, I think, collect good practices, and two, to be able to promote this idea of companies proactively taking action, we launched an award for small and medium-sized enterprises, which recognized their actions for elimination of forced labor. We did this together with the International Organization for Employers. And we had a small committee in place that was then able to award the awards, and certain criteria in which the submissions were judged. And the submissions, they were, for example, one of the criteria was looking at collaboration, and that they were working together with others, in recognition of the fact that forced labor is an issue that's often very difficult to tackle alone. So how were they either bringing this back to contribute to the greater good, to support other businesses from learning, or how were they working directly with others to help them to improve and solve challenges on a continual basis. So I think this is something that a link that I'll be able to share in the chat afterwards, where we then documented these practices that were submitted, and drew out some lessons learned and how these could be applied, for example, by other small and medium-sized enterprises. It was an effort. Initially, it was quite difficult to get interest. It's something that we do hope to grow in the future, but I do think that it's really an example how, if it's driven by an association or those that are really working together directly with the private sector, that there's more opportunity to, for example, shape the criteria, and also to do this, to frame this in a positive manner as well. One example from the network membership, from the Consumer Goods Forum, they publish a booklet on business actions against forced labor. It's actually quite an interesting booklet, again, something that I can share with you as a link, but they update this quite regularly. And what I've enjoyed about this booklet is it acts both as a learning tool, again, by showcasing good practices in company action, but it's also a way of highlighting the positive contributions of companies. So particularly in terms of what is a very negative issue, forced labor, how do we then turn that around and showcase the proactive and positive contributions of companies that are being made? So this booklet, it's effectively a number of different case studies that have been drafted by the Consumer Goods Forum, or put together by the Consumer Goods Forum on the basis of contributions from their membership. So I think the members themselves, they like to contribute to this booklet, again, because it's an opportunity to showcase in a more in-depth manner exactly what they are doing. And this then, as opposed to sort of more the modern slavery reports, for example, that they're doing, that these are, of course, that's a great way to get more information, but this is a more concise way that it is able to be used, for example, more by the general public, by other companies, etc., and to take this information forward. So it's effectively another form of really documenting. Specifically, they use it for pilot projects that companies have been enacting, so not for the sort of more general things that would go into corporate sustainability reports, but for also really focusing on key pilots that companies have been rolling out. One other example that I wanted to give you, that this is driven by employer organizations from the US, and it's been around for quite a while now, is the Engaging Business Conference. It's hosted by the Coca-Cola Company, but really driven by the International Organization for Employers, the US Chamber of Commerce, as well as the US Council for International Business. And they came together again with this challenge of, well, how do we positively recognize companies and also create a platform for learning and sharing of information? So this conference has been around for some time now. I believe it's been at least 10 years in the running, and it's again more broadly looking at social issues in general, human rights issues, I should say, but of course takes a strong focus from time to time, depending on the year, on forced labor and fair recruitment. So this is another way in which employers have come together to really support the interests of their members and to showcase them. So hopefully that gives you a couple of examples of what's been going on at global level, but also in different countries from different industries. And really, just to recap, I think the focus has been primarily on taking the codes of conduct. So how do we turn that into something that's monitoring, but that's very much industry driven and industry owned, because there's been through, for example, the benchmarking that I've mentioned, that this has been something that's almost been imposed on industry as opposed to industry driven. So I think you're sitting on a really key moment in time now, and a key opportunity to how do you take this forward as something that's very much industry owned and industry driven. I think it's also key that this becomes not only a ranking or rating exercise, which I think can be the temptation, but also how do we then use that as a learning exercise as well, and to support companies in that learning journey, because as we know, it's often not up to companies alone to solve this issue. There are many other influences and factors, and so working together with others and using, for example, the opportunities to share good practice and peer learning opportunities can be key. So I think we have 8 or 9 minutes left of the session, so perhaps I stop there and we can take questions.
Excellent, Lara. Thank you very much. Very inspiring, very informative as always. Many thanks for this. I think really certainly we have food for thought, the ammunition for the discussion. And I think I really took note of the importance what you said about the ownership. I think this is really the key, to have something that is owned by the industry, by the businesses, that has a pretty good chance of succeeding as versus that is imposed. I think this is very important. But also the rankings and the other issues and the learning from it and the positive encouragement is very relevant. So thank you very much, Laura, for this. I really hope you will be able to stay with us throughout for the discussion as well as the question answers now. To the extent you can, it will be much appreciated. Dear colleagues, either in the chat or in the, let's say, in raise your hands. We have a lot of participants. I might not exactly see it, but please, if you have any questions to the presentations or comments or thoughts that you would like to share, we have few minutes exactly left, so kindly by Laura for that. It is the time now. I open the discussion for questions. I see Rodion Kolishko from the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine raised the hand. Rodion, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for this presentation, and Joel, thank you very much as well. There has been a lot of information that Laura has shared with us, but I'd like to go back to the question about the leadership or ownership, maybe responsibility for the things the companies are doing trying to prevent forced labor. Your latest example of Coca-Cola and the US Chamber of Commerce, well, that has been a very topical issue, and big companies nowadays are on it. Some of them are partly present in Ukraine. They haven't been seen doing a lot in terms of combating forced labor here, but maybe over time we will be able to check with them and see what they're doing elsewhere in the world. But still, my question is this. Nowadays, Ukraine is experiencing trying times. There is an economic issue as well here. Have you heard of any cases anywhere where companies would do something in the countries which were experiencing war or economic trouble? Have you heard of cases where the companies in those countries would try to take care of the rights of workers, would try to prevent forced labor and abide by labor standards, international labor standards? And in those cases of any, did those companies take initiative to do it? So it would not be something imposed by the government, it would be something they would initiate on their own. It may be something about corporate social responsibility, but that would be something the companies realize they need to do. So I don't know if you have heard of such cases elsewhere. If so, tell us about them.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the question. I mean, obviously very pertinent to the context in which you're working to take this forward. I think I don't have specific examples to share with you in terms of conflict-driven situations and where companies have within that setting. I think that many more global businesses, if I can say, who are, for example, operating in certain contexts, they do generally have more specific guidelines that they will develop. For example, in the case of Myanmar, for a while, companies were coming together to discuss, well, how do they continue to do this in a responsible way, or whether they leave entirely the context, etc. So there is a lot of dialogue, and I think that much of this then does get or is, particularly by industry associations, being distilled into principles of what to do within those settings. So I think that it's very context dependent as well, depending on the situation and what the global companies are facing. But I do believe that many of them, they take this responsibility fairly seriously in terms of taking into account the context and then developing their actions on the basis of that. It's something we're in the process actually of redeveloping the ILO has some guidelines that were developed with the IOE a couple of years ago. And one of the aspects that we wanted to strengthen within these guidelines is looking at conflict affected situations, as well as the responsibilities of companies in that regard. So it should be available later this year. And within that, we hope to strengthen some of the examples as well as just the guidelines in general. So perhaps Zolta can, when we get there, I'll be able to share that with you, and hopefully that answers the question in a better way then.
Excellent, Laura. Thank you very much, because that would be very, very useful indeed. And also thank you, Rodion, for a very good question, because indeed, if we are doing something together, the peculiarity of ongoing war, and even in those extreme situations that we are able to discuss ways and means how to do it, shows testimony of the importance given by the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine to this issue, but also from colleagues from the labor inspectorates who are here with us today, because the extreme situation caused the displacement and caused these vulnerabilities arising. So that certainly is. But also, I think that this would be also relevant once the war is over, for the rebuilding and reconstruction, for the return of qualified individuals, making sure that there are systems in place that would prevent from any potential future ones getting in. I mean, there is already a discussion that I had a chance to attend with the EBRD in London at the end of February, when they were discussing about possible guidelines to be included to prevent these issues for the reconstruction contracts in Ukraine once the war is over. In the construction, in other spheres where there is likely to be the movement of quite significant financial means. And of course, I think once this information that Laura referred to about situations of conflict around the world, and thanks a lot also for sharing the example for Myanmar and also perhaps others, it will certainly be of relevance here. Are there any other questions from the participants to the presentations you have heard so far? I would risk, if there are some questions, we can go perhaps few minutes from the coffee break to accommodate that, should you wish to pose some of the questions in relation to this. I don't see any hands raised. I don't see anything in the chat. That could mean two things. That could mean two things, at least. That could be more than that, of course. I do not deny it. First of all, that the presentations were clear-cut and it was fully understood, or that you're really eager to have your coffee or tea and to resume with your re-energized sort of sense after the coffee break. Whichever of the two. If you then don't see any questions right now, please feel free to put in the chat any questions if you feel more at ease putting that in the chat, or you can pose it perhaps later on in the discussion we have. So I would like to thank Laura for the presentation, and let's close this segment of our workshop. Why we have gathered here today, in essence, was to trying to find the best modalities, the best based on the needs that would reflect of the ambitious and the situation in Ukraine. So I think based on what we have heard this morning and some of the questions and the discussion that we have had, you already have maybe a sense of where the discussion is going with this. But I think sharing the international good practices and sharing some interesting approaches is just one part of it. Perhaps the very important part and the most important part is to take on the views. And I think this has been what Laura has been already mentioning in her presentation, taking on the views of the Ukrainian stakeholders in this. And I think the best way would be to actually have this segment of our discussion when we are having the possible modalities to be explored for Ukraine in terms of the way forward. And we will have here a presentation or views expressed from the employer side. We'll have the views and a presentation expressed from the State Labor Service side, and then we'll have a little discussion. So I hope this is acceptable to you. I hope this is in line with your expectations. And so I would like to give the floor now to the representative from the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine, to Madame Stepanenko, for the presentation. I understand you will give us a snapshot of some of the thoughts and concepts and issues as being seen from your side. So the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome everybody. I was delighted to have this overview of what other companies and countries are doing. And now I would like to share the guidelines that Confederation has produced, and I will speak about other initiatives. I have listened to the presentations by Zsolt and Laura, and we can see that businesses and their associations can play an important part in combating forced labor and trafficking in humans. The initiative taken by the Confederation of Employers is called Ukraine Without Free Labor. Without forced labor. Back in December, we presented these guidelines. We appreciate support and assistance from the ILO. We adapted those to Ukrainian employers to their needs. So let me show you what we did in order to think of proposals, and I'll also tell you how we're considering doing this in practice. There are certain guidelines developed by ILOs, so we looked into the Human Rights Declaration, International Pact on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and that's where we see that people are supposed to grant their free consent to employment or work. There are also ILO products, and there have been so many, and Ukraine ratified some. Convention 29, which is a fundamental convention on forced labor. Convention 105, 182, 181, 129, the ILO Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and the Rights at Work of 1998. In this country, there are lots of documents in the legislation, so it prohibits forced labor. There is a right to free choice of work. You can see it in the Constitution and in the Labor Code of Ukraine. There are strategic papers in this country which say that the priority is to combat forced labor. You can see this in the SDGs for Ukraine, in the human rights strategy at the national level. Forced labor is not just a breach of legislation, it is a crime, as Zsolt suggested. Article 149 of the Ukraine Criminal Code actually says that. So there are all reasons to combat forced labor in this country. There are other soft instruments like international initiatives, which Ukraine has supported. There are guidelines for multinational companies approved by the OECD. There is a UN Global Pact and guidelines in business and human rights, which are a part of the human rights strategy in this country. So here you can see these guidelines. They are in line with the ILO standards. And based on these guidelines, we started thinking of making them a real deal. It should be a living document, and these should be the principles that employers, businesses could use in their daily activities. So businesses need to draft a list of issues, maybe a checklist of a kind, which would help employers see what they're doing. And while they're doing that, they need to make sure that they not use forced labor. Spoke with the businesses, and we can see that sometimes it's a really fine line between forced labor and non-forced labor, and we have to account for that. So our initiative is to make a checklist for employers in order to see if they're in line with the guidelines on forced labor. And this will be key in applying the guidelines, allowing to detect forced labor, the risks of forced labor in a company, and even sector-wide and across global supply chains. This kind of audit may contribute to the detection of forced labor in order to be able to combat it and eradicate it in the country. So this checklist is in line with the guidelines you can see in the screen. So you pick one particular item of the guidelines, And then you can see a question for a business, like, are all workers allowed to have official employment relationship on their own will? Have they given a consent to that? Is there an official contract? Does that determine particular work conditions? Was there any coercion? Has a worker been able to grant their consent? Have they been able to do it without pressure? So all of that is done to make sure that people have consented to particular work conditions. Apart from free choice of work, it is important to make sure that people can choose to terminate their employment at any point in time. The law says that there should be a notice, but at any point in time, in certain circumstances, they can choose to terminate their job. There may be evidence in place that an employer would get in the way of that, and that is wrong. According to the guidelines, the freedom of employment suggests that all people can choose a work and they should be able to exercise their rights that are envisioned by the contract. No one is supposed to make a worker continue their employment through threats or pressure. If workers are vulnerable, you're not supposed to offer them the work conditions that are worse than what the law envisions. There should not be threats of violence or other instruments that are not applicable. So should there be a threat of using sexual, physical violence, persecution of family members, or this particular worker, threats to the family, if they chose to stop working. Well, if this happens, this suggests that there is forced labor in that company. No one is supposed to be made to work. Sometimes what they do is that they keep you working, promising to pay for the work, but at the end of the day never do. Sometimes the paycheck goes to the family or the relatives, but not the worker themselves. So all of that suggests that there are certain risks in this country, in this company, the risks of forced labor. In-kind payments are also wrong because it makes these people totally dependent of the employer. A company might issue some vouchers, coupons instead of a paycheck. This is unacceptable as well. Sometimes the pay is lower than what the government guarantees, or the garnishment of your wage exceeds the size of the wage itself, and then people end up in that bondage. It also indicates that there are risks and even manifestations of forced labor in that company. There should be no disciplinary action used against the worker as a way of keeping them to work. Disciplinary action at work is not supposed to include sanctions, making somebody work either for free or throughout some time or against some other criteria. So the disciplinary sanctions themselves are not supposed to make you work forcibly. So if this is used as a way of keeping somebody to work, then it's a wrong way of doing things. In this case, a worker cannot stop working because they owe the employer, and there are threats from the employer to apply particular sanctions of this kind. Overtime, this might be indicative of forced labor, so you gotta check in this to see if people are supposed to work overtime beyond the limits of the law or the contract. There's a need to see if people are supposed to work overtime in order to at least make the minimum pay. Hard work conditions themselves are not suggesting that it is forced labor, but over time it may lead to forced labor because the workers are supposed to do overtime longer than the law envisions. A worker becomes vulnerable because there are threats of firing them, and then they have to work overtime or longer than necessary. In some cases, you're paid once you have done your job, and sometimes people have to do overtime in order to complete the task, to complete the job, because only then they're going to be able to get paid at least the minimum. Theoretically, under normal conditions, people can choose to refuse to do it. But if the workers are vulnerable and they cannot refuse to do it, then practically it means they don't have any choice and they have to work in order to keep their minimum pay intact or to keep their job or both. So in that case, employer abuses the vulnerability of the worker and they keep them at work by threatening to fire, dismiss them. So in this case, It's worse than just indecent work conditions. These are the signs of forced labor. Then guaranteed freedom of movement. Joel said earlier that limited freedom may be seen in some countries, so it takes to do an audit to see if a worker can leave the company, can leave the dormitory outside the working hours. So sometimes there are limits in the mobility of workers, and sometimes you can see that they cannot get access to digital communication devices. They cannot receive information from particular sources. So there should be no limits like that imposed on workers. They should not be kept inside certain premises as prisoners in a company or in some other locations where they live. This is prohibited. It is, however, allowed to make reasonable limits, allowing people to have access to some parts of the company compound, because this might be a part of wash practices in that company, and workers are not supposed to be there where it's unsafe, for example. Next thing, advanced training courses are not supposed to be used as a way of keeping people at work, making them work further for the same employer. So training, advanced training and all of that cannot be a reason to make somebody keep working for you. A worker can choose to retire or to quit at any point in time, but this matter has to be regulated in order for the employer to get a compensation for the cost of training. But people who have completed the training course are not supposed to work it off by working for this employer for a certain time. These workers are not supposed to give up their completion certificate and so on. So all of the advanced training courses that employers offer should be used by workers voluntarily. And all of this should be handled based on the balance of interests of both parties of the employment relationship. At the end of the day, a worker can freely terminate employment, so the completion of a training course should not be in the way of this right. Next thing, non-discriminatory treatment of migrant workers. So migrant workers are supposed to enjoy the same working conditions as the locals in terms of paycheck, and they should enjoy the same benefits and perks as everybody else. So all of that should be non-discriminatory. They should be on equal terms with the rest of the employees. The worst forms of child labor should be avoided as well, and employers have to take care of this. The company should not have anything suggesting that children are involved in some kind of forced labor, because the employment of kids underage is outlawed, because in that case there might be a criminal offense. Well, certainly the checklist can be further modified. It's not carved out in stone. Businesses cannot do all of that alone. They need to work with government institutions and social partners. There is a need to keep promoting these provisions as a way of combating forced labor. So I think it should be highlighted in the sectoral agreements, national agreements. There is a need to work with labor inspectorate and other government institutions. And that's how businesses will get an incentive to work on this and to seek advice on this. They will be able to consider these things while drafting their policies, while thinking of training their staff. I guess that's where there is a lot of space for cooperation with the government agencies, and hopefully our products will help all of us work together to avoid the risk of using forced labor in this country. And if there is something like that going on, it will be taken care of and eradicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Olena, dear Mrs. Stepanenko, for this very interesting presentation and about the voluntary checklist and self-check mechanisms. And I think what you have done, in fact, is taking some of the provisions from the guidance and the guidelines and put into very practical questions that the businesses on a very practical level can take to make sure that they check their compliance with those very same principles. This is an excellent initiative, and I want to thank you for that, for presenting it. You also mentioned in your presentation that it also takes for a good opportunity for the cooperation with the government, including labor inspection. So I think it will be very interesting for us now to move on to the next presentation that will be about the take is from the SLS side, from the side of labor inspection. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Igor Degnera for his presentation in relation to the topic we're discussing and further to the presentation we heard from the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine. Before that, though, I also want to say that it is really, really remarkable, the cooperation with the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine by taking this rather fresh guiding principle, already having some checklists very practically based on that is actually very quick progression of translating it into practical tools. And I would like to thank you for that. All right, without further ado, Mr. Igor Degnera, the floor is yours.
Well, after all that has been said, I'd like to say that I appreciate the presenters, and there have been interesting, meaningful presentations. I'm interested in seeing what other countries are doing, what are their ways of stimulating the combat against trafficking in humans and forced labor. So it has refreshed my idea of that, and also Lena's presentation has been very useful. Well, we see that forced labor can be seen in multiple situations. Sometimes you get a very simplistic view of that, but if you dig deeper, it's a lot more complicated, and it can manifest itself in many ways, and you have to be aware of that. And that's why labor inspectors work on the ground, trying to keep this negative phenomenon from happening. It's hard to add something to what has been said already. The only thing might be this. Well, from our side, we're keen on working along these lines further. We keep doing this in peaceful time and wartime, because that's basically what we're supposed to do no matter what. And we're on it. So I'm certain that we're going to keep contributing to this cause. As I said earlier, it is good to see businesses involved in this more and more, and hopefully you're going to get more efficiency because of that. And the society at large will be able to see the necessity to do it. So at least we're going to get something going about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you very much, Mr. Degnera, for the comments and suggestions and recommendations, but also for the commitment, for your interest and your team to continue working towards the eradication of forced labor and trafficking. So I think we have, in fact, a very interesting part of this segment where we heard really the intention of the business side led by the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine, very specifically about the checklist that has been elaborated based on the guiding principles. And we also heard the commitment from the State Labor Service of Ukraine to actually further work on this. So I think this is a very good start for taking this further. And in fact, for the issues that are there, I think what is very clear from what I heard so far, and maybe I would just mention a few points if anyone would like to have comments on or discussion. It seems to me that basically the positive encouragement is the method of choice that comes across from what I heard. In other words, to develop something based on the already strong ownership by the business of the guiding principles, and based on that to develop these checklists, then that's one. Also, I understand that there's a very good possibility to have a common understanding between business and labor inspection about these checklists, the very same checklists. They could be used by both sides, of course, for different purposes and different issues, but there is a joint interest there in many ways. Then, of course, there could be the options of having some platforms to exchange information and exchange issues for social dialogue that would be determining how proactive this collaboration is. And then fourthly, to maybe also look into some sort of motivations for businesses to join, to reach that critical mass of businesses, of national champions, of chambers of commerce, of big companies and others who would sign on to this initiative. And I think that would also lead towards, first of all, raising the public awareness, and secondly, also to look into ways and means how this will reflect on and facilitate the work related to the work of labor inspection in a modern way, and how it could be done. Of course, many of these things will have to come with the reform of the SLS, with the mandate, with the issues related to this. But also, I think the voluntariness, the self-businesses could be a very important contribution in this regard. And I think it would be good to see that playing out. All right, are there any comments from the participants, whether it is colleagues from the territorial representation of the SLS or colleagues from the employer side that would like to raise some questions? Are there anyone who would like to add to the topics, the presentations we have heard so far? I understand Mr. Kolishko. Rodion, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsolt, and thanks to all of the colleagues for presentations. I'd like to make a point about the leadership and motivation of businesses. Well, we are experiencing hard times now, and we spoke with fellow colleagues about the importance of combating forced labor, but typically they tell us, we gotta survive first, and then we're gonna discuss everything else. So there is a particular paradigm businesses have to operate in right now. And we need to look for extra motivation for businesses so that the businesses could at least think of abiding by the provisions of the law. I guess something extra can be offered to them to keep them thinking about the future outlook. So once they have survived as businesses, and they will check back with the European and world community, the colleagues out there, and then there will be lots of questions about what did you do to survive? How could you work according to the law in these trying times? So at that point, it will be important to listen to these businesses that will share a lot from their experience, the experience of leadership and so on. And we as an organization will be ready to spread the word about these initiatives and these capacities. So hopefully the colleagues will contribute to that, and there's going to be ILO support as well.
Thank you very much for Rodion for these comments. It is well taken. We all understand it's a difficult, trying times. And I think that just shows the importance of taking some of the initiatives. And we understand there are some limitations to how far this can be taken. And I think this is worthwhile for all of us to consider. At the same time, it is because it is an ongoing situation that it's important, perhaps, to the extent it's possible, that it can be taken further. So nonetheless, I think it is great in that sense. So, but fully understand the limitations and fully understand the concerns that you have expressed. So grateful for that. Before giving the floor to Mr. Goncharuk from the State Labor Service, I also saw in the chat, a chat in Ukrainian though, from Mr. Sergei Sechin, who's saying that for that, in order to have the possibility of using the ILO norms or documents, there needs to be changes in the legislation of Ukraine, if I understand correctly. Mr. Sechin, would you like to give to take the floor and expand on your point?
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to speak. Hello, Igor and everyone. I have written this because there are many ILO materials, papers that have been ratified by Ukraine, the conventions and so on. But domestically, they're not seen as legislative enactments employers have to abide by. And I'm not speaking about employers only. Even some government institutions, some judicial institutions do not perceive these conventions as something they have to do. So based on these conventions, we may consider modifying the Ukrainian laws accordingly. And then the government institutions and social partners will see that that's what they're supposed to do. So here comes my idea. So the provisions of respective conventions should be transferred over to the Ukrainian legislation so that employers will see that now it's a part of the Ukrainian law. Maybe I'm wrong, but that would be my idea. I can respond to this. Well, everything that has been ratified is a part of the domestic law. In the conventions and declarations, you get some general provisions, but you have to think of procedural implementation mechanisms. And that's why laws have to be passed, or codes, because they actually tell you how you have to implement this on the ground. If you think of Ukrainian laws and the EU legislation and do they correspond each other, so work is in progress in order to make our legislation match the EU directives. Maybe from your experience, you can see that some of the provisions do not work in this country. Then we need to look into that and see why they do not work. And what can we do? What can we add to the legislation in order to make sure those provisions of the convention could be implemented better? While producing the checklist, we were thinking of the need to work with the Ministry of Economy, SLS, Confederation of Employers and Business Associations. So we need to work with them in order to draft an enactment of a kind which would motivate employers so that they would choose to complete an audit, they would do it voluntarily. I guess that was the point you were trying to make. So you just gotta need to specify a particular thing that should be addressed further. Let's do it. I'm pretty much supportive of what you say. Thank you, Elena. My point was not about employers, actually. I work in the government institutions, so I think of employers as social partners. So those decisions have to be made jointly. But we need to think of what SLS can actually do in court litigations, because courts do not see conventions as the part of Ukraine law. Although in the civil code, there is a way to do it. If you refer to a provision of a convention, the courts refer us back to the domestic legislation like the law 877 and say there's no such thing in that law, although some of the procedures are seen in the convention itself. So we gotta keep working jointly, modifying the domestic legislation in order to have a better tomorrow. I'm not speaking about sanctions, I'm speaking about procedural matters. Okay, I got it. So right now there is no particular law on labor inspectorate which would grant particular powers to the inspectorate that are envisioned in the convention, and it would not limit the powers at the domestic level. Yeah, there might be issues with that right now. That's a problem. I know it.
Thank you very much to both for Mr. Sechin for his comments, placing the larger picture, complex legal issue there, and also for Olena for clarifying some of these relevances when it comes to the specifics of the topics and the checklist as it is. I think that what I would like to say on this is that the ILO is working very closely with the government, with the social partners and others on the legislative steps that could be taken based on the ILO's recommendations, how some of the powers and mandates of the labor inspectorate could be in terms of its return to the full compliance with international labor standards. And I think this will be an ongoing discussion, both in a tripartite manner and in the legislative corridors of Ukraine. And the ILO will continue to support this process. However, independent from this, I think it is also worthwhile to note that the SLS team for more than 12 months now, have made a remarkable public awareness campaign to reduce forced labor and trafficking in Ukraine. I think Mr. Degnera mentioned this. Even with the soft skills, managed to reach a very considerable number of the population of Ukraine, and a rather effective campaign. Now, of course, for all labor legislation, there would be need eventually to return to the mandate and issues in relation to the inspection mandate in line with that. But that will be a discussion that will continue in parallel to do. I think what we're talking today about is the possibility to cooperate in making sure that some of these soft skills, we add another one that is important based on the developed guidelines, to have this checklist that Madame Stepanenko has been presenting as a one step closer to actually having yet another tool that will increase perhaps let's say the tools at the disposal. And I think this is an interesting one, because really it has, even though it's a soft one, it has the support of the business. And I think the key to the future of labor inspection in Ukraine, in my view, in parallel to the legislative challenges that you mentioned, Mr. Sechin, I think it will be the quality of discussion between the business community and the SLS that will determine how efficiently and how adequately would be possible to do many of the things that are at the moment still needs further dialogue. It's an important dialogue to have, and it's a very important discussion in general, not only on the topics we have today. But I think going back to the topics we have today, I think I had the hands of Mr. Volodymyr Goncharuk raised before, and while the debate took us a little bit away with some delay, for which I apologize, I give you the floor. Please, it's all yours, Volodymyr.
Gerald, hello. Well, I was thinking what I was supposed to talk about as I was following this debate. So based on what has been discussed so far, and the point made by Sergei Sechin about the ratification of fundamental conventions, which are relevant to every government institution, in particular the labor inspectorate. Ukraine has ratified all of that, but has not been able to implement it. They were partly implemented, like Instrument 295, 83, we know about that. And labor inspectors did use that in practice, and it's been a positive experience. Well, every country has its own ways in terms of implementing fundamental rights and provisions, like ILO conventions. So in this country, we're not, I would say, mature enough to fully implement respective conventions. Certain government institutions exert some pressure, or what they do gets in the way of employers' initiatives, because some employers are trying to work by the law. If you think of Ordinance 295 and 83, we try to exercise control, but we could not implement all of the provisions that we were supposed to. This is relevant to combating forced labor and trafficking in humans. As Elena earlier said, it takes joint efforts to try and do something about this negative phenomena, because undeclared work and forced labor often happen together, and there is a fine difference between the two. And some citizens may end up in trouble because of that. So it takes a joint effort from the National Police, Ministry of Social Policy, other institutions, the Human Rights Commissioner. The SLS should take charge of this effort. So we're going to make sure that everything be done according to the labor law. We've had some experience doing it like this in terms of combating undeclared work. So we need to go back to the working group or task force that we've got, and we need to review the powers of the members of the group in order to let them do a better job. We also need to see which employers have to be inspected. And right now, what we do is mostly advice and recommendations that we share with them. But some of the employers deserve inspection visits, and some of them will be made responsible for doing the wrong things. But we have to select the employers which will be inspected. We don't need to go to all of them. We know which employers are working legally, so we don't need to inspect them all the time. The ones that are not working fully legally are the primary targets for inspection. We need to think of a mechanism for the bona fide employers in order to keep them working according to the law in terms of OSH and all that it implies. We earlier spoke with the employers. We tried to think of a mechanism for that, and Igor mentioned this earlier today. So we have to modify some of the regulations which will allow to review the schedule of inspections. If these employers have completed self-audit and they can prove their work by the law, then it's all right. We took part in developing these initiatives a while ago. So these guys can officially state that they work by the law, and then we can make changes to particular ordinances of the Cabinet of Ministers. And then the employers that have completed self-audit would not be inspected by us later on. This would be a motivation for them to keep doing this further. We also drafted a piece, but right now it is still a draft. It doesn't make any changes to the existing regulations. It's gonna be the self-audit checklist for employers. That's the idea. You can see this draft in the website of the SLS. So you get several questions, you respond to them, and in the end, the employer will get an official record saying if they operate by law or do they do something wrong. So that's the way in which employers will be able to do this self-audit. At least we're going to see if all of their workforce are employed legally. Then later on, we're going to see how it's going to pan out, and maybe we will make further changes to respective regulations. So we're on it. And I guess through joint efforts, we will be able to do a better job. I'm not saying that we're going to eradicate this thing right now, but we might obtain some unique experience compared to other countries in the world in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, especially for some of these very creative ideas and thoughts that you have had. Of course, it takes two to tango. It takes the two sides to agree on this, but certainly it is very, very interesting when it comes to that. I mean, of course, the self-audit checklists and the others are interesting, but I think I also see in the chat an interesting notion here, because we have the employers here. Can they maybe share with us just briefly in terms of what would motivate them? Indeed, that's what I saw also in the chat. Would that be the frequency of visits by the labor inspection is something that would motivate employers to get on the let's say the white list, or those that are in conformity in their self-declaration with the guiding principles? Can I just kindly ask someone from the business side, from the employer side, to respond to that? What could be the motivation for the employers for this?
Поки роботодавці будуть підключатися, можливо, хтось із підприємців. Я просто дійсно
While they are connecting, Vladimir has just said that we have had some meetings in the past, and we discussed ways in which we could motivate employers. We discussed the frequency of inspections, and there might be preferences offered to companies involved in public procurement through ProZorro system. We were also saying that if a company has completed the self-audit, now it can say they didn't have a risk of using forced labor, so this business has a policy of socially responsible business, and there haven't been cases of undeclared work with them or late payments. There may be more criteria which are in line with these guidelines and socially responsible business. So in that case, the government could offer certain perks, preferences to these companies as they take part in the public procurement. I think this would be quite a motivation for businesses. We were thinking of various classes of risk, but this is still just like an idea, so we need to see if it's going to be an efficient way of doing it. The government side keeps running with this awareness-raising campaign on undeclared work, and there have been workshops, and Zholt's project has trained some trainers on that, and they spoke in front of business community. So businesses and trade unions would be involved in this awareness raising campaign. So if we see that there is lack of ambiguity, and if we see that there is ambiguity and there are different ways of interpreting something, then we're going to make sure that we all are on the same page. So I think it is important to continue this awareness raising campaign among the business community. Businesses should have people, experts that know the score, and they will contribute to drafting particular policies in the companies.
All right. Yes, thank you very much, Olena. Thank you very much, Mrs. Stepanenko, for these clarifications. I understand there is one hand raised by Mr. Yuri Ivanov. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm with the Secretariat of Human Rights Commissioner, Yuri Ivanov. Thank you, Elena, for your talk. Well, indeed, undeclared work leads to forced labor in many cases. So you have to address this issue comprehensively. There is a draft law which addresses the powers of labor inspectors, but this draft is so nascent and is getting nowhere fast in the Supreme Council. I don't want to offer more powers to labor inspectors because inspectors might abuse them, but we also have got the police, and they may abuse some of their powers, but nobody is supposed to prohibit the police. So if you think of undeclared work, you have to address this comprehensively. So inspectors must gain more powers. We need to modify other laws relevant to what SLS does, relevant to reporting. This will help SLS check back on non-bona fide employers. We should review the licensing conditions, the licensing legislation. People who use undeclared work are not supposed to be granted licenses and permits in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that it is an important aspect of our discussion, the larger picture of the mandate of SLS and the inspection visits, unannounced visits, and those others that are in line with the ILO Convention 81. But coming back to the discussion on the issues of forced labor and that of what the businesses could do to do the risks and what it can be done. I think it's important to see what is and what is feasible to do already with the given circumstances right now. But I think there is, in parallel, I fully agree, there is a larger discussion on that, and we have had a chance this week to address shortly the Parliament of Ukraine on the discussion related to the SLS and issues related there. Mr. Degnera was also there and others. Coming back to the discussion, I think we are conscious of the time. We are 5 minutes over. I think it would be good to try to sum up this part as well before we get to the final concluding remarks in relation to this. Because also, rather neatly, this part concludes yet another, let's say, package of our activity from our repurposed or partially repurposed activities of our project that is coming with this event today to an end. I think that it's worthwhile to note that we have had, as I mentioned, for the last 12 plus months, an excellent collaboration with SLS, who started the public awareness campaign very early on, and all this. And as of last summer, we have had the employers joining with the developing and elaborating the guiding principles. And then it was adopted. And now with the campaign, Ukraine Without Forced Labor, we're discussing about entry points about possibilities. And I think it is a very interesting and very timely one, and that was presented by Madame Stepanenko, considering the checklists and the steps that the businesses could do to reduce those risks. And this does not give away the time for the needed for the discussion on the larger debate on the mandate of SLS related to inspection visits. To the contrary, this is actually something very concrete that can go on. And this is also providing, in difficult circumstances, I think, an illustration of from emergency to development transition, as it will be hopefully towards when the war is over, and there will be possibilities to recourse to many of these issues that we are discussing now, including the larger reform. Now, I would like to leave the floor now for some final comments by colleagues from the employer side. So I will, and also for the SLS side, and then perhaps if Laura in Geneva will have some final comments, and then whoever would like to take the floor, so that we, even with the academic quarter of an hour, but we finish more or less on time. We have had a very rich discussion, and I'm grateful to all of you for, especially in these trying times, that you find half a day to be with us. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rodion Kolishko and then to Mr. Igor Dignera for the concluding remarks.
Thank you. It's been a very meaningful conference, and I'd like to once again thank the project and you and your team and the ILO for what you do. So those have been magnificent 3 years. I know on the 14th of April there's going to be a final event, and you will be presenting the overall results of the project. So I hope the project will continue in some way. I also would like to thank my fellow employers who responded to our initiatives, and in spite of all of this trouble, they keep working with us, looking for ways of abiding by the labor rights and standards, both national and international in this country. Also, I'd like to thank our colleagues from the SLS for the dialogue we have had lately while preparing for this event. And we have been able to jointly develop some initiatives, and some of them were mentioned here earlier on. We also did the questionnaire. We made the questionnaire, and that was quite a good tool as well. So I appreciate all of the colleagues who have contributed to this. I hope we're going to have some time to discuss these recommendations. Well, we need to put them on paper first, and we need to share them with respective institutions. And most importantly, we need to get the consent from businesses to take part in the events like that. We need to let everybody know that there is a voluntary way of abiding by these standards and principles. So thank you so much indeed, and let's keep in touch. I'll see you around.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. I would like to give for the concluding remarks to Mr. Igor Dignera. And then actually after that to Laura for a short comment. And then the very end, I think my colleague Sophia has some few words that I would very much ask her to please share with us. So that is the one. And I would also use this opportunity to thank you, Rodion, and the team at the Confederation again for the excellent cooperation, not only just in this field, but also in the larger field. It has been our pleasure. Mr. Dignera, the floor is yours.
Well, I agree to what Rodion has said about the project. You have been a reliable partner all the time, and it helped us successfully implement a project on combating the forced labor and trafficking in humans. We can see a growing number of businesses joining the cause. So it's not only the SLS doing this, but we can see some of that getting done on the ground. If we keep on it, then we're going to find ways of doing it better, and this effort will continue on. And then at the end of the day, all of the stakeholders would keep this matter on their radar, and the they would try and make sure forced labor and things like that would never happen here again. And my service will only be trying to stimulate these initiatives, keeping them running. So once again, I'd like to say kudos to the SLS people and labor inspectors, because they are the ones who are actually doing the job out there in the field. And when you can see particular results of that, you realize that it's not been a waste of time, and that gives you quite a lot of inspiration to keep on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you very much, Mr. Degnera. Indeed, kudos and congratulations to the team of SLS from the regions, from the oblast, from the headquarters, and everyone for this work. I would like to join that wholeheartedly. And thank you very much for your leadership and your support in this endeavor. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Laura Green for the concluding remarks and thanking her for being our guiding light and participating in these endeavors and sharing a lot of valuable information in the process. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsolt. I won't take much time, but just to say thank you and please to turn to the network if you're looking for more information, support, or any other resources. Even if we don't have it ourselves, surely within the membership, we're often able to reach out and look for additional examples. So please keep that in mind as a resource that's at your disposal. And again, well done and congratulations on the great work, and look forward to being able to continue to work with you. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Laura. It is really for us to thank you. I would like to give now the floor to someone very special who has been the institutional memory, but also the beating heart of this project from its very, very beginning, for decades even, when it comes to some of the issues we're discussing now. Someone that I'm proud to call my colleague in this endeavor. Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsolt, for this opportunity. So it's a good opportunity to get in touch with the labor inspectors from across the country. Maybe it's the last time we're doing this under the project. It's nearing its end. It's going to be hard to say goodbye, but there's going to be one more event coming up, the training on OSH for SMEs on the 20th and 21st. It's going to be done offline, and those attending it will enjoy the live communication. It's going to be something a lot better than what we're having right now. But this format is a lot better than having no meetings at all. It still allows us to keep discussing things that have been topical for the last 3 years. The project has contributed a lot of time, knowledge, and resources to this cause. And you have gained a lot of insights as inspectors. And every time we get a lot of feedback from you, there has been a lot of impact. And there have been many changes that have happened in the labor inspectorate over the last 3 years. We can see people are better in communication. We can see meaningful strategies of the SLS. We can see good ideas about optimizing the operations of the SLS. Some ideas are still in the pipeline and they will be implemented later. There have been positive changes in the information part, for example, but we haven't reached the point where we could say that our SLS is fully in line with the international standards. It hasn't happened yet. So maybe this event will help you all understand that the SLS needs to have adequate powers. Otherwise, we won't be able to handle particular issues in the labor market, like forced labor, child labor, undeclared work, trafficking. All of those are horrible and unsafe things for the labor market. And the SLS within existing powers can do too little to handle this thing. Employers need to understand, at least bona fide employers, as well as the government and the parliament, they need to understand that the powers envisioned by the convention will allow to do a lot better job in handling those issues. So let's make it a key recommendation after this event. And let's find a way in which labor inspectors will gain a lot of trust in these matters, and you guys will be able to do a good job showing everybody that ILO standards can be implemented in practice, allowing to handle labor market problems. That's my dream of a kind. So I hope it's going to happen at some point, but you will be on it pretty much on your own. It's up to you to find the best way to do it. You will do advocacy, you will promote ideas. So SLS should be modern, it should be oriented towards addressing existing problems, and it should be able to deliver great performance. I appreciate the 3 years that I have spent working with you. Back over to Jolt.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And yeah, it's true. I would like to second all that you have said. Definitely, it is and has been the issues, and I think it continues to be. And this is our shared dream, and I think the shared vision in many ways, and that will continue to be, whichever form and way we can contribute. I also want to say two more things very briefly, maybe abusing your hospitality a little, but I'm not intentionally trying to do that. One is that we'll have the official closing event of our project on the 14th. Sophia already wrote in the chat. Of course, it will not be the last one. There is the training for the SMEs on the 21st, and there is, of course, the World OSH Day that will continue on the 27th to have events with you. But please, we would be grateful if you would consider joining us on the 14th for the official closing event of our project. And secondly, we also wanted to play a video at the very end of this, because as a testimony of the great cooperation and the excellent work we have had with the Confederation of Employers of Ukraine, there is a little video that was created by them on the very same topic we have been discussing. And I would like to kindly ask our IT colleagues and technical colleagues to play that video at the very end of our event. So please just bear with us for a few more moments.
За оцінками Міжнародної організації праці, наразі 21 мільйон людей у світі є жертвами примусової праці. Військові дії, нестабільність економіки, мобільність населення, трудова міграція, збільшення безробіття сприяють поширенню експлуатації людини та роблять вразливі соціальні групи ще вразливішими. Ця проблема особливо актуальна для України. У зв'язку з російським вторгненням майже 8 мільйонів українців та українок стали біженцями. Серед них переважно жінки та діти. Через війну майже 5 мільйонів людей вже втратили роботу, а кількість вакансій скоротилася удвічі. Примусова праця має дві сукупні ознаки – примус до роботи та загроза покарання за відмову виконувати її. Вона може набувати різних форм – погрози і залякування, поневолення чи утримання особистих документів, спекуляції із виплатою зарплатні, використання понаднормової праці без належної компенсації та інші форми. Будь-яка примусова праця є злочином за українським та міжнародним законодавством. Окрім того, що для бізнесу експлуатація людей означає кримінальне переслідування, це також ризики репутації, заборони співпраці у певних країнах чи з багатьма компаніями, які очікують відповідності критеріям соціальної відповідальності та прав людини. Під ризиком для таких компаній і будь-які інвестиції.
Війна змінила все. Через неї багато українців залишилися без роботи. Зросла кількість зайнятих в тіньовому секторі економіки. І значно зросли ризики використання примусової праці. Ми проти того, щоб заробітна плата використовувалась як форма примусу до праці. При цьому форми оплати праці, які не дають можливості припинити трудові відносини, є неприпустимими. Будь-яке навчання, освіта або підвищення кваліфікації не може бути в подальшому використане роботодавцем для того, щоб утримати працівника на робочому місці або змусити його компенсувати ці витрати. І це в майбутньому дозволяє вступити в нормальні відносини без жодних ознак примусової праці.
I would like to thank you for your attention. Дякую за увагу. And we will meet each other in the rest of the month on the events we have had. For today, thank you very much. До побачення. Дуже дякую.
До побачення.